Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Saigon, the Buddhist crisis takes a turn for the worse. In Birmingham, a civil rights leader's home is bombed. In the nation's capital, security measures are announced for next week's March on Washington. The Castro regime is charged with kidnapping. General Eisenhower signals support for the test ban treaty, and a massive brawl breaks out at Yankee Stadium. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Kitchen floors where dirt is thicker. Mr. Clean will clean 'em quicker. Bathrooms faster, rec rooms too. Leaves more leisure time for you.
Mr. Clean will clean my house so fast, and every floor that's in it, he can save me 15 seconds out of every cleaning minute.
Mr. Clean, Mr. Clean, Mr. Clean.
At the White House Thursday, President Kennedy met with his new ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge. At a press conference after the meeting, Mr. Lodge was asked to define U.S. policy in South Vietnam.
I think the policy of the United States ought to be to help the Republic of Vietnam to win and maintain its freedom from communist terrorism. And that any event or any action which promotes that objective, we are for, and anything which hinders that objective, we are against.
As for the ongoing conflict between the Diem regime and the Buddhist majority in South Vietnam, Mr. Lodge said he'd rather not comment until he'd seen the situation firsthand. Buddhist leaders have accused the Diem regime of religious discrimination.
Well, I would tell anybody that America is committed to respect for people's religious convictions and religious tolerance, and that's what I would say to anybody who asks me a question about America.
Does that mean you'll be arriving on the scene with a sympathy for the Buddhist cause?
It means I'll be arriving on the scene as an American who believes in religious tolerance.
Mr. Lodge's comments reflected the administration's growing concern over the Buddhist crisis and its effect on the U.S.-backed war against the communist Viet Cong. That crisis took a sharp turn for the worse today, as just after midnight, President Diem's troops and police shot their way into Saigon's main Buddhist pagoda and seized other pagodas throughout the country in a determined effort to break the back of the Buddhist protest movement. At least one monk was shot to death, 30 monks and nuns were wounded, holy objects were destroyed, and leaders of the Buddhist movement, along with hundreds of others, were arrested. In addition, the whole country went under martial law, and a rigid curfew went into effect. Roving patrols had orders to shoot curfew violators on sight. This afternoon, President Kennedy conferred at length with State Department officials about the crisis, but delayed further action pending new developments. Ambassador Lodge, who was in Tokyo, was ordered to rush to his new post in Saigon at once. In Birmingham, Alabama last night, a bomb exploded in the garage of Arthur Shores, a Negro attorney and integration leader. The blast, which was heard 10 miles away, blew in Mr. Shores' garage door and damaged his 2 cars and the room overhead. Neither he nor his wife, who were both at home, were injured. The 58-year-old attorney, who has been called Alabama's drum major for justice, has used his legal skills to support civil rights issues since 1938. Shortly after the explosion, roughly 2,000 angry Negroes rushed to the scene and hurled rocks at police, who fired carbines and shotguns over the rioters' heads. As the riot grew in intensity, the Reverend A.D. King, younger brother of Dr. Martin Luther King, leaped on top of an automobile and tried to calm the crowd, shouting, quote, "My friends, we have had enough problems tonight. If you're going to kill someone, then kill me. We cannot beat the police, but we are going to win this town, regardless of what they do. Stand up for your rights, but with non-violence," unquote. The crowd eventually dispersed. 1 week from today, 8,000 police, National Guardsmen, Army and Marine units, and members of the fire department will be on the alert in the Washington, D.C. area as up to 300,000 civil rights marchers descend on the Capitol. At a news conference today, Washington Police Chief Robert Murray emphasized that no trouble was expected at the Mammoth March, adding, quote, "However, there will be a very large crowd, and we intend to be able to meet any situation and to protect the right of all persons to participate peacefully in this demonstration," unquote. At yesterday's press conference, President Kennedy was asked to predict the effect of the demonstration, both on the country and the Congress, where the president's civil rights bill is being hotly debated.
I think the purpose, of course, is to attempt to bring to the attention of the Congress and the country the strong feeling of a good many thousands of citizens. I don't know how many are going to come. What we're really talking about is a problem which involves 180 million people. Not 180 million people, which seems to me have elected the Congress and elected some of us to attempt to deal with that matter, so that this issue does not stand or fall on the August 28th. The August 28th is a chance for a good many people to express their feeling, but it's hard for them, a lot of other people, to travel. It costs them money. Many of them have jobs, so that I think that what we're talking about is an issue that concerns all of our people and must, in the final analysis, be settled by the Congress and by the executive branch working with 180 million people. This is an effort, however, to bring focus to the strong concern of a good many citizens, so that I think, as I said before, it's in that tradition that I meet with the leadership, and in which I think that it's appropriate that these people and anyone else who feels themselves who are concerned should come to Washington, see their congressman.
In a related question, the president offered his views on racial employment quotas. Such quotas have been proposed by some as a means of correcting the effects of discrimination against Negroes in hiring.
Some Negro leaders are saying that, like the Jews persecuted by the Nazis, the Negro is entitled to some kind of special dispensation for the pain of second-class citizenship over these many decades and generations. What is your view of that in general? And what is your view in particular on the specific point that they are recommending of job quotas by race?
Well, I don't think that is the generally held view, at least as I understand it, of the Negro community, that there is some compensation due for the lost years, particularly in the field of education. What I think they would like is to see their children well educated so that they could hold jobs and have their children accepted, have themselves accepted as equal members of the community. So I don't think we can undo the past. In fact, the past is going to be with us in a good many years in uneducated men and women who lost their chance for a decent education. But we have to do the best we can now. That's what we're trying to do. I don't think quotas are a good idea. I think it's a mistake to begin to assign quotas on the basis of religion or race, color, nationality. I think we get into a good deal of trouble. Our whole view of ourselves is sort of one society. Now, that hasn't been true, but at least that's where we're trying to go. And I think that we ought to not to begin the quota system. On the other hand, I do think that we ought to make an effort to give a fair chance to everyone who's qualified, not through a quota, but just look over our employment roles, look over our areas where we're hiring people, and at least make sure we're giving everyone a fair chance. But not a hard, fast quotas, so much for we're too mixed, this society of ours, to begin to divide ourselves on a basis of race or color.
In Oxford, Mississippi Sunday, 30-year-old James Meredith received a degree from the University of Mississippi, thus becoming the first Negro graduate of the 115-year-old institution. Mr. Meredith, an Air Force veteran, received his Bachelor of Arts degree in political science just 100 yards from the scene of bloody riots that marked his admission last September. On Sunday, there were no incidents, and local policemen stationed at the campus had little to do but watch the ceremony. The Reverend William Arthur Pennington of St. Andrew's Methodist Church in Oxford delivered the invocation, stating, quote, "We live in a difficult time, when it is apparent that men do not love one another. Let us pray for unity out of discord, love out of hate, hope out of despair." Unquote. I'll have more news for you after this message.
Hi, darling. Hurry and get ready for dinner. PTA meeting tonight.
Ellen, please. I just got home. Don't rush me. Control yourself. Sure, you have a headache. You're tense, irritable. Don't take it out on her.
You need Anacin for fast relief. The big difference in Anacin makes a big difference in the way you feel. Minutes after taking Anacin, headache pain's gone. So tension's gone. Irritability's gone. You're in control again. Yes, you get fast relief. You keep control. The big difference in Anacin makes a big difference in the way you feel.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
On Thursday, State Department spokesman Richard Phillips charged Fidel Castro's Cuban regime with kidnapping 19 Cuban refugees from British territory in the Caribbean. He made the charge while responding to a statement from Havana that Cuban gunboats had captured 2 fishing boats in the Bahamas and seized, quote, at least 4 counter-revolutionaries, unquote. Men from 2 Cuban warships and a helicopter seized the 19 refugees on Anguilla, a small island halfway between Florida and Cuba. As for the 4 so-called counter-revolutionaries, Havana said they were agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, who had been plotting raids from British territory. Earlier this month, Cuban tensions erupted in New Orleans when a former U.S. Marine distributing pro-Castro pamphlets on Canal Street was angrily confronted by 3 anti-Castro Cubans. All 4 men were arrested and charged with disturbing the peace. Last week, the ex-Marine, 23-year-old Lee Oswald, was interviewed by William K. Stuckey on New Orleans radio station WDSU.
I always felt that the Cubans were being pushed into to the Soviet bloc by American policy. I still feel that way. Our policy, if it had been handled differently, and many others more informed than I have said the same thing, we would not have the big problem of Castro's Cuba now, the big international political problem. Although I feel that it's a right development in Cuba, still we could be on much friendlier relations with them, and had the government of the United States, particularly certain covert undercover agencies like the now defunct CIA. And
now defunct?
Well, its leadership is now defunct. Allen Dulles is now defunct. I believe that without all that meddling, with a little bit different humanitarian handling of the situation, Cuba would not be the problem it is today.
He was asked if he believed the Castro regime was not a communist front or a Soviet colony in the Western Hemisphere.
Castro is an independent a leader of an independent country. He has ties with the Soviet Union, with the Eastern Bloc. I think it's rather obvious as to why and when and where, because of the fact that we certainly don't have any trade with them. We are discouraging trade with that country, with our allies and so forth. So, of course, he has to turn to Russia. That does not mean, however, that he is dependent upon Russia. He receives trade from many countries, including Great Britain to a certain extent, France, certain other powers in the Western Hemisphere. He is even trading with several of the more independent African states. So that you cannot point at Castro and say that he is a Russian puppet. He is not. He is an independent person, an independent leader of his country. And I believe that was pointed out very well during the October crisis, when Castro very definitely said that although Premier Khrushchev had urged him to have on-site inspection at his rocket bases in Cuba, that Fidel Castro refused.
This afternoon, Mr. Oswald returned to the WDSU studio for a debate with Carlos Branier, one of the anti-Castro Cubans who had confronted him on August 9th. During the debate, Mr. Branier asked Mr. Oswald if he agreed with a statement Fidel Castro had made in July about President Kennedy.
Do you agree with Fidel Castro when in his last speech of July 26th of this year, he qualified President John Fitzgerald Kennedy of the United States as a ruffian and a thief?
I would not agree with that particular wording. However, I and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee does think that the United States government, through certain agencies, namely the State Department and the CIA, has made monumental mistakes in its relations with Cuba. Mistakes which are pushing Cuba into the sphere of activity of, let's say, a very dogmatic communist country as China is.
Mr. Oswald, would you agree that when Castro first took power, would you agree that the United States was very friendly with Castro, that the people of this country had nothing but admiration for him, that they were very glad to see Batista thrown out?
I would say that the activities of the United States government in regard to Batista were a manifestation of not so much support for Fidel Castro, but rather a withdrawal of support from Batista. In other words, we stopped armaments to Batista. What we should have done was to take those armaments and drop them into the Sierra Maestre, where Fidel Castro could have used them. As for public sentiment at that time, I think even before the revolution, there were rumblings of official comment and so forth from government officials against Fidel Castro.
During today's program, it was revealed that Mr. Oswald had lived in the Soviet Union for 2.5 years, returning to the U.S. in June of last year with a Russian wife and child. During a brief TV interview after the debate, Mr. Oswald was asked if he was a communist.
No, sir, I'm not a communist, and I think that the red herring and so forth is rather ridiculous to toss into this conversation.
Then are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Oh, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
Former President Eisenhower, returning Thursday from a tour of World War II invasion beaches in France, strongly implied that he would back the treaty for a limited nuclear test ban. The treaty, initialed last month by the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, is being debated now before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. General Eisenhower said he would give his comments to the committee in writing after careful study, adding, quote, "But I do think this. Unless there is evidence of which I know nothing, unless there is some rather hard evidence that the Soviets are way ahead of us in something, or that the security of the United States would be endangered, then I would certainly be on the favorable side," unquote. Critics of the treaty, including Dr. Edward Teller, who assisted in developing the hydrogen bomb, have made two primary objections. First, they say the treaty will prevent the U.S. from catching up with the Soviet Union in very large-yield weapons of 60 to 100 megatons. Second, they say the treaty will prevent atmospheric testing necessary for development of an anti-ballistic or anti-missile missile. Last week, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara countered both arguments at the Senate hearings. On the first point, he said the U.S. had decided against developing a 100-megaton weapon because effective results could be obtained by using, quote, 2 or 3 smaller weapons instead of one very large one, unquote. As for the anti-ballistic missile, Mr. McNamara said developmental problems could be solved by scientists from available information and that they could, quote, design around the remaining uncertainties, unquote. At yesterday's press conference, President Kennedy responded to charges made by Dr. Teller and others who oppose ratification of the treaty.
Dr. Teller, in urging the Senate to reject the nuclear test ban today, said that it weakens American defenses and thus invites attack because information that's necessary to develop a surefire anti-missile missile can only be developed through atmospheric tests. What do you have to say to this?
Well, I think Mr. McNamara answered that very clearly. Other scientists have answered it. I recognize Dr. Teller has made it very clear that he's opposed to it. He opposed it all last week and this week. Now, there are a good many other scientists with comparable experience. We have a scientific advisory committee to the president. We have other scientists who worked on nuclear matters. We have Nobel Prize winners and others. We have members of the military and others who think that the test ban is a source of strength to us. I understand Dr. Teller's opposed to it. Every day he's opposed to it, and I recognize that he's going to continue to be opposed to it. I think that the question was very clearly answered by Mr. McNamara on what effect the atmospheric test ban would have on the development of an anti-missile weapon. Now let's just think of the other side of it if we begin to test again, and the Soviet Union tests again, and others begin to test again. How much security do we have? As I said before in my message, I said to the Congress, we needed only one test to develop the Hiroshima weapon. Now, to anyone who works in the laboratories today, a 30 megaton weapon is perhaps not as sophisticated as a 60 or 70 or 80 megaton weapon. But it's still many, many, many times, dozens of times stronger than the weapon that flattened Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How many weapons do you need and how many megatons do you need to destroy it? I said in my speech, what we now have on hand without any further testing will kill 300 million people in 1 hour. And I suppose they can even improve on that if it's necessary. So on your specific question, I refer you to Mr. McNamara's answer, which I think is the clearest and most specific answer that you could possibly get on what effect the atmospheric test ban will have on the development of this weapon.
Despite some divergence of opinion among scientific and military leaders, it is widely believed that the test ban treaty will be ratified by a large margin. Sources say there is a general view in the Senate across party lines that the treaty could be a small step toward the easing of Cold War tensions, and that its rejection would seriously damage America's world leadership. Sports, right after this.
Last night, did you lie awake, unable to get to sleep? And then, during the night, were you unable to stay asleep? You need Sleepies, 100% non-habit forming. That is, 100% free of addictive drugs. Yet Sleepies brings on sleep fast as a doctor's prescription of phenobarbital. Is just as effective in giving deep, sound sleep. So next day you wake up fully refreshed, fully alive. Take Sleepies as directed, 100% non-habit forming.
At Yankee Stadium tonight, a beanball exchange during the second game of a doubleheader between the Yankees and the Indians resulted in one of the wildest brawls in the 40-year history of the stadium. The Yankees won both games by identical 3-1 scores, as players and coaches fought, wrestled, kicked, cursed, screamed, and rolled in the dust. The crowd of 25,108 became caught up in the frenzy. Most were content to shout words of encouragement to their heroes, but some of the more zealous partisans vaulted the barriers and tried to join the festivities. The most damaged combatant was Larry Brown, rookie Cleveland shortstop, who limped off the field of battle with a foot that required 4 stitches. Teammate Dick Hauser suffered a minor spike wound. Cleveland manager Bertie Tebbetts had a cut on his left foot, and Yankee manager Ralph Houck pulled a thigh muscle during a tugging contest with an unspecified adversary. The 2 lead players in the fracas were Cleveland pitcher Gary Bell and first baseman Joe Pepitone of the Yankees. Bell drew an automatic $50 fine for what plate umpire Lou DeMuro interpreted as deliberately throwing at Pepitone. Pepitone was ejected by DeMuro for charging Bell and then punching his Cleveland counterpart, first baseman Fred Whitfield, who was attempting to restrain him. Whitfield suffered head and facial bruises. Unsurprisingly, Houck blamed everything on the Cleveland pitchers, who he charged were deliberately targeting Pepitone because he was a hot hitter. Tebbetts denied the charge, stating, quote, "When I played ball, the only ones we threw at were 300 hitters. They don't have any 300 hitters," unquote. For the record, the Yankees do have one, Yogi Berra, who caught the first game today and is batting .311. Following today's fight-filled double victory, the Yankees hold a 10-game lead over the second-place Chicago White Sox. Turning to the National League, the largest Dodger Stadium crowd of the year, 54,125, got their money's worth today as they watched the longest game played this season by their heroes. Sandy Koufax, gunning for his 20th victory, started for the Dodgers against Curt Simmons of the Cardinals. Although Los Angeles won 2-1 in the 16th inning, Koufax did not get the win, as he was lifted by manager Walter Alston for a pinch hitter in the 12th, after having made 164 pitches. Before he was removed, Koufax had struck out 10 batters, the 49th time in his career and the 9th time this season that he has fanned 10 or more in a game. He's now 5 shy of the Major League mark of 54 10-strikeout games, shared by Rube Waddell and Bob Feller. The Dodgers now hold a 7.5-game lead over the second-place Cardinals. And finally tonight, Al Davis, the new head coach and general manager of the American Football League's Oakland Raiders, expressed dismay today over the circumstances that led to the cancellation of an exhibition game between his club and the New York Jets that had been scheduled for Friday night in Mobile, Alabama. Davis said, quote, "We're disappointed. We thought we had the problem licked," unquote. He was referring to earlier assurances by Mobile promoters that there would be integrated seating at Ernie Ladd Memorial Stadium for the annual benefit contest. 4 Negro players for the Raiders, Art Powell, Fred Williamson, Clem Daniels, and Bo Roberson, had said they would not play unless stadium seating was fully integrated. So, when the promoters backed off their original pledge, Milt Woodward, assistant commissioner of the AFL, requested the cancellation. David Sonny Werblin, the new owner of the Jets, formerly the Titans, said today that he supported the game's cancellation. There are 8 Negroes on the Jets team, including 4 starters. The game has been rescheduled for Sunday in Oakland. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Wednesday, August 21st, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.